which is an important term, I think, in relationship to this work, and also the experience of the post-communist context as well. And it's one, for me, it's helpful to recall the definition of Robert Young in his book on post-colonialism. And he defines the post-colonial as, the neo-colonial as, if colonialism was the political relation where one country occupies and controls another politically, economically, militarily, then decolonization occurs, removing that control. But in neo-colonialism, the context is the political and social and military presence is evacuated, yet the economic control remains. And you see this very clearly in the South African context. Mm-hmm. So that the neo-colonial, the continuation of multinational, largely European and American companies to dominate the economy of South Africa, as well as the IMF and the World Bank to impose the economic rules by which the new country exists, even though South Africa now has local, of course, independent sovereign political control. This is the complexity of neocolonialism, according to Robert Young. And you see this very clearly in McQueen's work. So for me... You see the awareness of this particular problem. Or at least the effects of it, because McQueen doesn't give you that kind of detailed history. It's very much an effective, non-discursive, non-cognitive work, in a way, that shows you the physical conditions of existence under this, under these conditions, I think. Mm-hmm. And so for me, McQueen's was a new kind of representation in terms of its difference from earlier moments of artistic practice organized around the development of multiculturalism and identity politics. So within those developments, which dominated, at least for me, early discussions within artistic practice, political artistic practice in the 80s and 90s. So there, the 93 Whitney Biennial was a real threshold event within the North American context. And this is another question for former West. Where does North America fit into this whole research project? Because I think that's something else that's largely left out. And I think, especially if you consider the importance of the development of economic and political, NAFTA, NATO, and the development of the economic political matrix of neoliberal democracy, so-called democracy, then surely the states, the United States, is a key player within this development. Even if, of course, the political registration of '89 didn't immediately change things in the States, as it did, much more viscerally and immediately in Europe. But whereas within the practices of that are now identified with identity politics, this was largely organized around a representation that was meant to recognize the other, recognize difference. And so the face, or the legibility of the minority subject was what was stressed and staged in the '93 Whitney Biennial, or the Decade Show at the Studio Museum in Harlem, or other exhibitions in the '90s, and as well as artistic practice. And I think, there are many writers that were considering this development in complex ways, including Edward Said, including Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, post-colonial theorists who are, as well as Edward Glissant, who's become very interesting and important for me. Post-colonial theorists who were in a way hesitant about embracing the representation of recognition, of minority recognition, because of the dangers of creating a new kind of representational straitjacket for subjectivity. And so McQueen's work, as well as other artists like Emily Jasir and Ita Barada, or I mean, there's a whole range. The Lebanese Walid Rad and Lamia Jarej and Khalil Jarej and Joanna Haji Tamas. Hito Steirl, I think, also relates to this in some ways. Ursula Biman. These are a range of artists that I've been thinking about, and surely there's others. In a way, suggest a new approach to representing difference, which is to stress the opacity of the image, to stress the impossibility of simple legibility. So in a way, it's a refusal of recognition. It's a refusal of the old trajectory, the old political strategies of those involved with identity politics, to think that one can know the other. And I think you see a similar development within feminism also, in terms of earlier second wave feminism, and the dangers of essentialism that come with recognition, to a later stage of feminism in the work of people like Judith Butler, who are much more sensitive to the instability and the mobility of the image.
To what extent do you think that these problematics can only be invested in images rather than, say, objects, right? Somebody like Duchamp made objects, and artists today are making images. So there's a very legible, readable transition away from the object toward the image, which has to do in part with the facility of technological advances and so forth since the beginning of synchronized sound, right? So, and I'm just thinking in terms of art practices, if and again this is pure speculation, but there were two particular critiques of Wieser's documenta that I remember. One was that it was so heavily time-based, video-based, that it was impossible to see all of the works. Which is, I think, a critique that comes up over and over and over again. It was another critique at the Berlin Biennial as well, right? So I mean, it's just, this is our lot. We are stuck with having to sit in dark rooms for a minimum of 50 minutes if we want to understand what's going on in our room. So anyway, that we can talk about what that means for the spectator maybe another time. But there had been a very important shift in the way in which viewers experience works of art as well, thanks to these developments in technology. And then the other critique was that this focus on the document and this focus on the document and the documentary, which are two terms that become conflated in the critiques, I think, led to a kind of emptying out of the aesthetic to a certain extent. And your work, I think, actually proves in your analysis of specific artworks that that's not true. So now I have to remember what I was first asking you. So yes, so are we now then, I mean, is it at all possible, or can you think of particular artists who are able to formulate a similar kind of critique outside of the use of the image? And in that way also bypass some of this sort of repetitive kind of critique that the only way to represent subjects politically is through some kind of reportage or something that's based on image making.
Yeah. For sure. I would agree with the terms of your question, the way you set it up, because Documenta 11 was criticized for being documentary heavy and time-based, although I think I understood it from the beginning that this was an acknowledgement. The fact that you couldn't see all the work during the exhibition was self-conscious at the time, and it was an acknowledgement of the impossibility of having any totalized knowledge.
Sure, as with the platforms. I mean, unless you have a very strong academic or institutional support that will give you the budget to travel to all of these places, you wouldn't possibly be able to get a totalizing image.
Yeah. So I think that critic is speaking from the position of belief that an exhibition can be fully experienced, I would disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and yes, in many ways, my work has been dedicated to investigating the aesthetics of works of art, largely in photography and film and video, that has some kind of relation to the social and political world. Whether we call that documentary or post-documentary, because it doesn't perpetuate the same kind of traditional approaches of documentary practice that existed then. It's a new invention of the conditions of relating to the social and political world. So in a way, maybe it's necessary to put the term documentary in quotations. At least I would, I think. A group that was important, I noted, to Steve McQueen, but also for me, is Black Audio Film Collective, going back to the 80s, and doing work that was largely film-based. It was investigating the conditions of social and political struggle in a post-colonial British context under Thatcher, but doing so with tremendous subtlety and aesthetic sensibility, and mobilizing aesthetics in a very interesting political way, but also mobilizing aesthetics in a way that resists, again, that condition of recognizing, thinking that one, in some kind of ethnographic sense, can recognize the other, right? Resisting that potential totalizing relation to the subject, because that's I think really crucial in their work, and they're I think a very important precedent for what comes later. And I think they're important, as well as Haroon Farooqi, a couple very different artists, but Godard and a lot of filmmakers are crucial as well to the development. And I don't know, while it came to my mind, I might as well say it now. I think that also the former West's focus on exhibitions is problematic also. Since '89, to look at exhibitions, and this came across for me in the Utrecht conference, the first conference, where there was, in a way, an all too easy acceptance of this kind of, in some sense, and sometimes, narcissistic curatorial self-regard. The curators, and there was clearly a very important curatorial turn that has happened, where the production of curatorial knowledge has become a new kind of object of inquiry and practice. But to potentially reject the developments within artistic practice outside of exhibitions, to reject the discourse of art history and art writing outside of exhibitions and exhibition catalogs, and to reject the movements of theoretical and political discourse, or if not reject, to minimize or to displace in favor of curatorial projects, I think is a real problem. And a limitation, a potential limitation, at least at the first Congress.
Well, there was very little discussion of specific works of art and
Yeah.
no visual analysis.
Yes, yeah.
For example.
Yeah, exactly. So I think where is the accounting for the movements of the image and relationships to representation, or as you're getting at now, to performance or installation or sculptural developments, general developments in artistic practice in the post-communist or the post-colonial context. I think that was, for me, sorely missing in that Congress. So I hope that those questions can be taken on board in at least more of a balanced way. Without failing, of course, to look at exhibition history as well.
The whole question of the exhibition as an object of study has several different sort of problems attached to it, right, in terms of the question of evidence, and you know this very well from looking at the archives for the Surrealist exhibitions or for Duchamp's own exhibitions, that what you're actually looking at is documentation, two-dimensional documentation, and very interestingly at the Tate After All conference on the artistic and the social, or something like that. I can't remember the title, but we'll